They locked him in America's most notorious prison, a concrete island designed to break the strongest men. For 15 years, they tried to erase him. But behind those walls, Bumpy Johnson wasn't breaking. He was planning. And when he walked out, Harlem would never be the same. This is the story of how Bumpy Johnson survived Alcatraz and the federal prison system, not just with his life, but with his mind sharper, his reputation stronger, and his strategy deadlier. And when he returned to Harlem in 1963, he didn't just reclaim his throne. He rebuilt an empire. If you're here for the real history, the survival stories, the strategic brilliance, the untold chapters of Black Power, hit that subscribe button now. We're diving into one of the most remarkable comebacks in criminal history, and you don't want to miss a single detail. Bumpy Johnson was already a legend by the late 1940s. He'd survived the war with Dutch Schultz. He'd built alliances with Italian mobsters while maintaining black control over Harlem streets. He'd become known as the Godfather of Harlem, a man feared and respected in equal measure. But in 1952, everything came crashing down. Bumpy Johnson was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for drug-related charges. And not just any prison. He'd spent time in some of the most brutal facilities in America, including Alcatraz, the island fortress in San Francisco Bay that was designed to hold the nation's most dangerous criminals. For most men, a 15-year sentence would be the end. A erasure. A slow death behind bars. But Bumpy Johnson wasn't most men. His time in prison wouldn't break him, it would refine him. He'd use those 15 years to study, strategize, and build connections that would serve him when he returned. And when he walked out of prison in 1963, at age 58, he'd do something almost impossible: reclaim his position at the top of Harlem's underworld. This is the story of how Bumpy Johnson survived the federal prison system, how he maintained his influence from behind bars, and how he orchestrated one of the most strategic comebacks in criminal history. This was more than time served. It was survival, transformation, and the building of a legacy that would outlast him. By 1952, Bumpy Johnson had been operating in Harlem's underworld for over 3 decades. He'd survived street wars, mob conflicts, and constant police harassment. He was smart enough to avoid most legal trouble, paying off cops, using intermediaries, and keeping his hands clean on paper. But the federal government had been watching. In the early 1950s, the FBI and federal prosecutors were ramping up efforts to dismantle organized crime networks across America. They weren't just targeting Italian mobsters anymore. They were going after black operators too, especially those who'd grown too powerful to ignore. Bumpy Johnson was at the top of that list. The charges against him stemmed from drug trafficking, specifically conspiracy to sell heroin. By the late 1940s, heroin had become a plague in black communities across America, and Harlem was ground zero. Italian mobsters controlled the importation and wholesale distribution, but street-level dealers were often black, and enforcement fell disproportionately on black neighborhoods. Bumpy's involvement in the drug trade has been debated by historians. Some say he was deeply involved, seeing it as inevitable and profitable. Others argue he was more cautious about heroin, recognizing the devastation it caused in the community he claimed to protect. What's clear is that federal prosecutors built a case connecting him to a distribution network. In 1952, Bumpy Johnson was arrested, tried, and convicted. The evidence was circumstantial but sufficient. Witnesses testified, some coerced, some paid, some genuinely cooperating. The jury delivered a guilty verdict. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison. For a man in his late 40s, that was essentially a life sentence. Few expected Bumpy Johnson to survive, let alone return to power. But here's the twist. Bumpy had been preparing for this possibility for years. He'd built networks that could operate without him. He'd groomed loyal lieutenants who could manage operations during his absence. He'd stashed money in secure locations and made arrangements for his family. And he'd cultivated relationships with people, both inside and outside the prison system, who would prove invaluable during his incarceration. Bumpy Johnson wasn't going to prison unprepared. He was going to survive. And he was going to come back. Bumpy Johnson served time in multiple federal facilities during his 15-year sentence, including the infamous Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. Alcatraz, the Rock, was America's most notorious prison. Located on an island in San Francisco Bay, surrounded by freezing waters and strong currents, it was designed to be escape-proof. The facility housed the country's most dangerous criminals, gangsters, murderers, and men who'd caused problems in other prisons. The conditions were brutal. Cells were tiny, barely 5 by 9 feet. Prisoners spent most of their time in solitary confinement or lockdown. The cold was constant, seeping through concrete walls. Food was minimal. Violence was common. Guards were ruthless. Psychological torture was part of the design. Isolation, silence, the crushing weight of knowing you might never leave. For black prisoners, Alcatraz was even worse. Racial segregation was unofficial but enforced through violence. Black inmates faced discrimination from guards and attacks from white supremacist prisoners. Resources were allocated unequally. Racism was woven into every interaction. Most men broke under those conditions. Some went insane. Others gave up entirely, becoming shells of who they'd been. But Bumpy Johnson adapted. Here's what made Bumpy different. He understood that prison was just another system, and every system has rules, hierarchies, and opportunities for those smart enough to navigate them. Bumpy quickly established himself as someone to respect, not through reckless violence, though he could handle himself physically, but through intelligence, discipline, and strategic thinking. He studied constantly. He read voraciously philosophy, history, military strategy, psychology. He learned from other prisoners, especially older convicts who'd survived decades behind bars. He observed the guards, learning their routines, weaknesses, and motivations, and he built alliances. In prison, survival often depends on crew, a network of people who protect each other, share resources, and navigate conflict together. Bumpy aligned himself with other black prisoners, offering mediation, advice, and protection. He became a leader not through intimidation, but through respect. He also, remarkably, maintained connections to the outside world. Through carefully managed correspondence, coded messages, and visits from trusted associates, Bumpy stayed informed about Harlem's underworld. He knew who was rising, who was falling, who was loyal, and who was betraying him. He couldn't control operations directly, but he could influence them, offering guidance, settling disputes, and ensuring his interests were protected. If Bumpy's strategic brilliance inside prison is blowing your mind, drop a like on this video. It helps more people discover these incredible survival stories. Bumpy Johnson's time in prison wasn't just about survival. It was about transformation. He entered prison as a street-smart gangster. He left as something more, a strategist, a philosopher, and a man with a deeper understanding of power, loyalty, and human nature. One of the most fascinating aspects of Bumpy's incarceration was his reputation among other prisoners, including white mobsters. Alcatraz and other federal prisons housed Italian mafia figures, Irish gangsters, and criminals from every ethnic background. Racial tensions were constant, but Bumpy earned respect across those lines. His intelligence, fairness, and strategic mind made him someone people listened to, even men who wouldn't normally associate with black prisoners. Stories from Alcatraz suggest that Bumpy mediated disputes between different factions, preventing riots that could have gotten everyone hurt. He was known for giving solid advice, whether it was legal strategy, how to handle guards, or how to maintain sanity in isolation. One former inmate later recalled, "Bumpy was the kind of guy you wanted on your side, not because he was the toughest, though he could handle himself, but because he was the smartest. He thought 10 steps ahead. Always." That reputation mattered. It meant Bumpy had influence even behind bars. It meant he was building alliances that would serve him after release. And it meant that when he eventually returned to Harlem, his name still carried weight. But here's the question that haunted everyone who knew Bumpy. Could he actually reclaim power after 15 years away? Harlem had changed. New players had emerged. Old allies had aged or died. The Italian mob had tightened its grip on drug distribution. The civil rights movement was reshaping black consciousness and community organizing. The streets Bumpy left in 1952 weren't the streets he'd returned to in 1963. Could a man in his late 50s, after 15 brutal years in federal prison, Really come back and dominate again? Most people doubted it, but they didn't understand Bumpy Johnson. As Bumpy's release date approached in the early 1960s, two things were happening simultaneously. Inside prison, he was preparing for his return. Outside, Harlem was evolving rapidly. Inside, Bumpy was finalizing his strategy. He knew he couldn't just walk back into Harlem and expect things to be the same. He needed intelligence, allies, and a plan. Through his network of visitors and correspondents, Bumpy had maintained connections with key players in Harlem. He knew which of his former associates were still loyal. He knew which had betrayed him or grown weak. He knew where the money was flowing and who controlled what territories. He also understood the broader changes happening in Black America. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum. Malcolm X was preaching black pride and self-determination in Harlem. Martin Luther King Jr. was leading nonviolent protests in the South. Young black activists were questioning old power structures, including criminal ones. Bumpy recognized that his return couldn't just be about reclaiming territory. It had to be about relevance, about proving that he still understood Harlem's needs and could navigate its new realities. Meanwhile, Harlem's underworld had filled the power vacuum Bumpy left behind. Some of his former lieutenants had taken over operations and weren't necessarily eager to step aside. The Italian mob, particularly the Genovese crime family, had expanded its control over heroin distribution. New players, hungrier and more reckless than Bumpy's generation, were fighting for scraps. And then there was the NYPD, which had become even more corrupt and brutal. The heroin epidemic had given cops an excuse to terrorize black neighborhoods with impunity, conducting raids, planting evidence, and extracting bribes. For black families navigating these harsh realities, Harlem felt more dangerous and unstable than ever. Into this chaos, Bumpy Johnson was about to return. In 1963, after serving 11 years of his 15-year sentence, reduced for good behavior and other factors, Bumpy Johnson was released from federal prison. He was 58 years old, gray-haired, older, but far from broken. When Bumpy stepped off the bus in Harlem, the streets were watching. Would he try to reclaim power? Would he retire quietly? Would younger gangsters challenge him immediately? Bumpy's strategy was brilliant in its patience. He didn't come back swinging. He didn't immediately demand control or challenge rivals. Instead, he listened. He observed. He reconnected with old allies, assessed the landscape, and identified opportunities. Within months, Bumpy had reestablished himself as a major player in Harlem's underworld, not through violence, but through intelligence and strategic alliances. He formed a partnership with the Genovese crime family, negotiating terms that allowed him to operate semi-independently while benefiting from their political protection and resources. It was a delicate balance. Bumpy maintained black control over street-level operations while acknowledging the Italian mob's dominance in wholesale distribution. He also positioned himself as a mediator and protector within the black community. Younger hustlers sought his advice. Business owners asked for his help dealing with extortion. Families turned to him when the police or rival gangs threatened them. Bumpy was doing what he'd always done best, building power through respect, intelligence, and community connection. But his comeback wasn't without challenges. Some younger gangsters resented his return, seeing him as an old man clinging to past glory. There were tensions with former associates who'd grown comfortable in his absence. And the NYPD, aware of his reputation, kept him under constant surveillance. Yet Bumpy navigated it all with the strategic brilliance he'd honed during 15 years in prison. He knew when to compromise and when to stand firm. He knew who to trust and who to watch. He knew how to project power without unnecessary violence. And within a few years of his release, Bumpy Johnson was once again one of the most powerful figures in Harlem, not just in criminal circles, but in the community at large. His comeback was complete, but the question remained: how long could he hold onto that power in a rapidly changing world? Real talk. If you'd spent 15 years in prison and came home to a world that had moved on without you, would you try to reclaim your old life? Or would you start fresh? There's no easy answer. Drop your honest thoughts in the comments. I want to hear different perspectives on survival and reinvention. Bumpy Johnson's post-prison years were productive but short. He operated in Harlem's underworld until his death in 1968, just 5 years after his release. He died of a heart attack in a Harlem restaurant, surrounded by friends, still working, still strategizing, still relevant. In those 5 years, Bumpy had done what most thought impossible. He'd reclaimed his position, maintained his influence, and preserved his legend. But his legacy extended far beyond those final years. Bumpy Johnson's story, from Charleston to Harlem, from the streets to Alcatraz and back, became a blueprint for survival, resilience, and strategic thinking. He proved that intelligence could outlast violence, that loyalty mattered more than fear, and that even the most oppressive systems couldn't break a mind that refused to surrender. For Black communities, Bumpy represented something complex and contradictory. A criminal who protected, a gangster who strategized, an outlaw who belonged. He was flawed, dangerous, and morally ambiguous. But he was also brilliant, resilient, and undeniably ours. His time in prison didn't erase him, it refined him. And his comeback proved that power isn't just about physical strength or youth. It's about strategy, respect, and understanding the game better than anyone else. Bumpy Johnson's 15-year journey through the federal prison system is one of the most remarkable survival stories in American criminal history. He entered prison as a legend. He left as something more, a strategist who'd used isolation and hardship to sharpen his mind, deepen his understanding of power, and prepare for a comeback nobody thought possible. His return to Harlem in 1963 wasn't just about reclaiming territory. It was about proving that resilience, intelligence, and strategic thinking could overcome even the most brutal attempts at erasure. Bumpy Johnson's story isn't a simple tale of good versus evil. It's a complex narrative about survival in a system designed to destroy Black lives. It's about building power when legitimate paths are closed. It's about loyalty, betrayal, strategy, and the refusal to be forgotten. And it's a reminder that our ancestors, flawed, complicated, human, fought for dignity and survival in ways that shaped the communities we live in today. Bumpy Johnson didn't just survive Alcatraz. He conquered it. And when he walked back into Harlem, he proved that some legends can't be locked away. If this story of resilience, strategy, and comeback power moved you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We're documenting the untold chapters of Black history, the survival stories, the strategic brilliance, the legends who refused to be erased. Next up, we're diving into Bumpy Johnson's final years, his relationship with Malcolm X, and the legacy he left behind when he died in 1968. Like this video, drop a comment telling me what surprised you most about his prison years and comeback, and share this with anyone who needs to know this history. This is our legacy, our story, and it deserves to be remembered. See you in the next one.